My girlfriend said. I need freedom, no rules, no commitments holding me back. I agreed and walked away without resistance. Months later, she realized freedom meant losing the only person who actually stayed consistent in her life. I feel suffocated. That's what she said. Not in a fight. Not after a bad week. She said it on a Tuesday evening while I was washing the dishes. Casual, like she was commenting on the weather. I turned around, hands still wet, and looked at her. She wasn't even looking at me. She was scrolling her phone, and something in my chest just went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, the kind that feels like the moment before something breaks. I didn't say anything. I just dried my hands, set the towel down, and waited, because I knew. I knew that sentence wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the beginning of the end. And what happened next? It didn't unfold the way I thought it would. It unfolded in a way I'll never forget. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 26. She was 24. We'd been together for 2 years and 4 months. Her name was Becca. We met at a mutual friend's birthday gathering at a rooftop bar downtown. She laughed loud and moved easy through the room, and I remember thinking, that's someone who's fully comfortable in her own skin. I admired that about her. For a long time, I admired a lot of things about her. We moved fast at the start, the way people do when everything feels electric and you mistake intensity for depth. By month 6, we were spending most nights together. By month 9, we talked about moving in. By year 1, people around us assumed we were heading somewhere permanent. And honestly, so did I. But I should tell you something. Even in the early months, there were small things. Tiny things I brushed past because I told myself that's just who she is. She canceled plans last minute. Not often, but enough that I started building in mental buffer whenever we made them. She didn't like being asked where she was going. Not in a possessive way. I wasn't that guy. I mean, even the lightest, most natural, "Hey, what are you up to tonight?" could make her eyes go flat. Like a door closing. I noticed it. I just didn't name it. Because when things were good between us, they were genuinely good. She was funny and spontaneous, and she made ordinary days feel like they had color. So I kept the ratio in my head tilted toward the good. I told myself the small things didn't matter. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. About a year and a half in, something started shifting. Not dramatically, gradually. The way the temperature drops in a room, so slowly you don't realize you're cold until you're shivering. She started mentioning her friends more, which was fine. I wasn't insecure about that. But it wasn't just, I'm going out with the girls tonight. It was a different energy. Like she was building a life slightly beside ours rather than inside it. She started referencing things she'd done that I hadn't been told about. Not lies, she wasn't hiding them. But not shared either. Just casually dropped into conversation like footnotes. Oh yeah, I went to that new gallery thing last weekend. I didn't even know there was a gallery thing. I didn't say anything the first few times. Then one evening I asked, gently, whether things were okay between us. She looked at me with this expression that I can only describe as mildly annoyed. Why do you always need to analyze everything? I let it go. I was good at letting things go. Too good, maybe. Then came the Tuesday. The dishwashing Tuesday. After the suffocated comment, I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. Talk to me, I said. She put her phone down. She looked at me. And then she said something I wasn't prepared for. Not because it was cruel, but because of how rehearsed it sounded. Like she'd been turning the words over in her head for weeks. I think I need more freedom, she said. I feel like being in a relationship has these invisible walls, and I keep bumping into them. I kept my face still. What walls? I asked. She shrugged. Just expectations. Checking in. Feeling like I have to account for my time. I'm not built for that right now. I sat with that for a second. I've never asked you to account for your time. I know, she said, but I feel it anyway. And there it was. The thing that couldn't be argued with. Not the rules I'd actually enforced, because there hadn't been many, but the feeling of constraint that lived in her head regardless of what I actually did or didn't do. You can't negotiate with a feeling someone has decided is your fault. I understood that. So what are you saying? I asked. She looked down at the table. I'm not saying I want to break up. A pause. I'm saying I need space. Room to breathe. A relationship without the weight of all the commitment pressure. I looked at her for a long moment. You want to be with me, but without any of the things that make it a relationship. She frowned. That's not how I'd phrase it. How would you phrase it? She was quiet. Then she said, I want us to be free. Both of us. No rules, no obligations. Just be in each other's lives, but not caged. I nodded slowly, and then I said something she clearly didn't expect. Okay. She blinked. Okay. Yeah, I said. If that's what you need, I'm not going to fight you on it. She looked almost confused for a second, like she'd walked into a room expecting furniture and found it empty. So you're fine with this? I didn't say I was fine, I said quietly. I said okay. There's a difference. She didn't push it. I stood up, picked up my jacket off the chair, and said I was going to go for a walk. She watched me leave without a word. I walked for 40 minutes that night. No destination, just the cold air and the sound of my own footsteps. And somewhere in the middle of that walk, I made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a revenge decision, a quiet one. The kind that comes when you finally stop trying to hold something that keeps pulling away from you. I decided that if she wanted freedom, I wasn't going to be the thing that stood in the doorway begging her not to take it. I was going to let her walk through it. And then I was going to close that door behind her. Gently, without a scene, without hostility, but completely. The following week was strange. She seemed lighter. I noticed it immediately, the way she moved through the apartment, the way she laughed on the phone with her friends. Like something had been lifted. And I watched that and felt something complicated. Part of me ached. Part of me understood. And one small, honest part of me noted. She was relieved. Not because she'd solved something between us, but because she thought she'd gotten the version of me she wanted. The available, stable, caring version, without the version that came with expectations. She thought I was still there. She just didn't realize I was quietly collecting my things. Not physically, emotionally. The small investments I'd been making every day, the coffee I'd make before she woke up, the way I'd kept track of things she mentioned and circled back to them, the way I always showed up when she was having a bad day, I started pulling those back. Not dramatically, just less, 1 degree at a time. About 2 weeks after the conversation, her friend Petra called me. Petra had always been the more perceptive one in Becca's circle. Hey, she said, I heard about the conversation you two had. Yeah, I said. I just want you to know, Petra said carefully, that I told her it wasn't fair. I appreciated that. She thinks it's going to work, Petra said. She thinks you're going to stay exactly as you've always been, just with fewer strings attached. A pause. You're not, are you? It wasn't really a question. No, I said. I'm not. Petra was quiet for a moment. Good, she finally said. Just that one word. Then the call ended. A month in, I told Becca I thought we should officially call it what it was. What do you mean? She asked. I mean we're not together, I said. We haven't been for a month. Let's just be honest about it. She got quiet. I didn't think you'd actually. She stopped. Didn't think I'd actually what? I asked. She shook her head. Nothing. But I knew what she hadn't finished saying. She didn't think I'd actually accept it. She thought she'd offered the idea of freedom as a kind of test. Or maybe not even a test, maybe just a pressure valve. A way to feel less trapped without actually having to give anything up. She hadn't expected me to open the cage myself and walk out calmly. We had a final real conversation about 3 days after I called it official. She came over to pick up a few things she'd left at my place. And right before she left, she stopped at the door. Can I ask you something? Sure, I said. Were you ever actually happy with me? The question landed strangely, because it contained an assumption that my willingness to walk away meant I hadn't been. I said, for a long time. Then why was it so easy for you to just let go? I looked at her. It wasn't easy. She met my eyes. I let go because I love myself enough not to hold on to someone who wants to be uncapturable. She didn't respond to that. She left, and I sat with the silence and let myself feel it. All of it. The grief of it. Because even when you make the right choice, it doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it just feels like loss dressed in clarity. That was the last real conversation we had for a while. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2. I kept going. I'm not going to romanticize the process. It wasn't linear and it wasn't clean. There were nights where I replayed moments and looked for the version of events where it went differently. There were mornings where muscle memory reached for a phone to text her something small, and I had to consciously redirect. Grief doesn't announce itself politely. It shows up sideways. But I kept going. I started doing things I'd put on the back burner. A weekend trip I'd been thinking about. A hobby I'd picked back up. Long dinners with friends I'd seen less of because I'd been so centered on building something with her. It wasn't performance. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was just living, which sounds simple. But when you've been organized around another person for over 2 years, finding your own shape again takes effort. About 2.5 months after we officially ended things, I ran into her mutual friend group at a bar I used to go to before we were together. A few of them greeted me warmly. One of them, a guy named Connor she was close with, pulled me aside. "Hey, just so you know," he said, "the whole freedom thing hasn't really gone the way she thought." I didn't ask, but he kept going. "She's been kind of lost, man. She thought once the pressure was off she'd feel this huge relief. And maybe she did for a minute. But then it just felt empty." I didn't say anything. "She keeps asking about you," he said. Like, indirectly. "But it's obvious." I thanked him and walked back to my group. I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I maybe would have expected. I felt something quieter. Something that was more like sadness than vindication. Because the truth is, I didn't want her to suffer. I'd never wanted that. I just knew I couldn't be the sacrifice required to prevent it. 2 weeks after that, she texted me. 3 words. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a while. I won't pretend I didn't feel something reading it. Of course I did. When someone has taken up that much space in your life, they don't become a stranger the moment you decide to stop hurting yourself for them. But I also knew something important. I knew that whatever she wanted to say was going to be about her. About her realizing. About her missing. About her wanting. And the version of me she wanted to come back to wasn't the version she treated carefully. It was the version she'd taken for granted. The consistent, steady, always there version she decided she could have without the commitment that earned it. I took my time before I responded. Not to be strategic, but to be honest with myself about what I actually wanted. Because here's the thing. And this is the part one thing people don't always say out loud. Sometimes love doesn't end because it disappeared. Sometimes it ends because you loved someone who didn't protect it. I had loved Becca. Not just in the obvious, big ways. The trips and the anniversaries and the plans for the future. But in the daily, invisible ways. The ways that don't get recognized until they're absent. I remembered her coffee order without being asked. I remembered that she hated making phone calls, so I'd call ahead to restaurants and handle anything that required speaking to a stranger. I remembered the name of her difficult coworker and her landlord dispute and the thing her mother had said that still bothered her 2 years later. I showed up. Not occasionally. Consistently. Without needing it to be noticed. And that consistency had been invisible to her. Not because she was a bad person, but because it had become the wallpaper of her life. You stop seeing wallpaper until it's gone, and then the room looks completely different. I texted her back the next evening. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, "but I hope you're doing okay." She replied almost immediately. "I messed up." I read that, set my phone face down, and felt a kind of heartbreak that I wasn't expecting. Not the sharp kind that had already come and gone. The dull kind. The one that's not about anger or betrayal. Just about two people who didn't end up where they could have been. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her, but because I had nothing left to say that would have been useful to either of us. What she had wanted was the feeling of possibility without the responsibility of care. She wanted to feel unanchored without feeling lost. She wanted me available, but not close enough to need something from. And those two things can't coexist. Freedom and connection both require something. Freedom requires the willingness to be alone in that space. Connection requires the willingness to be known. She had wanted freedom without loneliness. But freedom is only exhilarating when it's a choice. When it's just what's left after everyone else has stopped waiting for you. That's not freedom. That's just empty space. I found out through Petra. We stayed in loose contact after everything. That Becca had a rough few months. Not catastrophic. Not dramatic. Just quiet and difficult in the way that comes from recognizing your own patterns when it's too late to do something about a specific situation. She'd gone out more. Spent time with the group of people she'd wanted the freedom to spend time with. And realized, over time, that none of those connections had the depth she'd been taking for granted at home. The people she was hanging out with were fun. They were social and available and easy. But they didn't know her. Not the way I had known her. They didn't hold her history. They didn't remember the small details. They didn't show up with the same quiet reliability. And she had traded all of that for the feeling of having no walls. I'm not telling this story to paint her as a villain. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't manipulative in a calculated way. She wasn't cruel. She was someone who didn't understand what she had until the shape of it was gone. And that's a human thing. A very common, very painful human thing. Most of us have been on one side of that equation at some point. Either the person who didn't see what was right in front of them, or the person who was right in front of them and went unseen. I had been the second one. And while that hurt, it also clarified something for me. It clarified what I actually wanted. Not just from a partner, but from myself. I want to tell you about a moment, about 4 months after everything ended. I was at a weekend gathering at a lake house a friend had rented out. Group of 8 or 10 people, some I knew well, some I was meeting for the first time. First evening, we were sitting on the dock after dinner, the kind of easy conversation that happens when people are relaxed and the light is going golden over the water. A woman named Cora was sitting beside me. We'd been introduced that afternoon, but hadn't really talked. She was quiet in a specific way, not shy, not withdrawn, but present, like she was actually listening instead of just waiting to speak. At some point she said something small but precise about a book she'd been reading, and I asked her about it. And then we talked for 2 hours. Not about anything important, just ideas and things we'd noticed and small observations about the world. At the end of it she said, "I always forget that conversations can actually go somewhere." I understood exactly what she meant. And I thought, this is what I was making room for. I didn't start anything with Cora that weekend. That's not the point. The point is what I felt in that moment. Not longing. Not the ache of what I'd lost. Just a kind of quiet recognition that the space I'd created by walking away from something that had been slowly hollowing me out, that space was real. And something better could fill it. Not by force. Not by seeking. Just by being someone who had enough self-respect to stop accepting the scraps of a connection that was being rationed out to me. 6 months after Becca and I ended things, she sent me a long message. I read it twice. She talked about how much she'd understood in those months, about what she'd actually had. She talked about how the freedom she'd wanted had felt like relief for about 3 weeks, and then started feeling like absence. She said she hadn't realized how much of her daily life had been quietly supported by the way I paid attention. She said she missed it. She said she missed me. She asked if there was any version of reality where we could try again. It was a sincere message. I'll give her that. There was no manipulation in it, no performance. It read like someone who had genuinely sat with their own realization and was now being honest about it. And I felt for her. I did. But here's what I wrote back. I kept it short, because I'd done all my processing already. And I didn't need the conversation to be long. I hear you, and I believe you mean this. But what you're describing, missing the consistency, missing feeling known, missing the attention, those aren't reasons to try again. Those are things you should look for in whoever comes next. And look for them before you get used to them. Not after. I really do hope you're okay. But I'm okay too. And I'd like to stay that way. I hit send, closed the app, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not closure. That word gets used too easily. But something more honest than closure. Something more like, I know who I am now. And I know what I won't do to myself again. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then. Consistency is not a weakness. Showing up quietly, reliably, without theatrics, that's not something to be taken for granted. It's rare. And it's expensive. In the way that anything worth something is expensive, it costs time and attention and emotional presence. The person who does that for you isn't background noise. They are, in a very real sense, the structure of the life you're living. And the cruelest irony is that the structure often only becomes visible when it collapses. There's something else I want to say. For whoever is reading this and recognizing themselves in the person I was, the one who kept showing up, the one who made it easy, the one who loved steadily and got rewarded for it by being labeled suffocating or too much or walls. You are not the problem. Consistency is not a cage. Love is not confinement. Those words were never really about you. They were about someone who hadn't figured out yet how to be present in their own life and found it easier to blame the person closest to them than to look at themselves honestly. Don't become smaller because someone couldn't hold what you were offering. Don't teach yourself to love less carefully. Just find someone who recognizes the value of being seen before they've lost it. The last time I saw Becca in person was about 8 months after everything. We crossed paths at a coffee shop downtown. She was with a friend I didn't recognize. She saw me before I saw her. I noticed because she looked away first. When I reached the counter and turned around, I caught her eye for just a second. She gave me a small smile, the kind that carries a lot of weight in a small space. I nodded back. Then I took my coffee and left. No conversation. No lingering. Just two people who had been something important to each other, meeting briefly in the ongoing forward motion of their separate lives. And I walked out into the day feeling steady. Not happy in a triumphant way. Not sad. Just steady. Like someone who knows where they stand. She said she needed freedom. No rules. No commitments holding her back. I agreed. And I walked away without resistance. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared enough about myself not to stay in a place where caring was being used against me. Months later, she realized what freedom actually costs and what she'd spend it on. But by then, the person who had always stayed consistent, the person who had held the shape of her daily life together without needing credit for it, had already moved on. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who truly loves you is convince them that their love is a burden. Because the day they finally believe you, they'll put it down and walk away and mean it.